Hi, everybody. I'm delighted today to be joined by my very good friend, Professor Anna Gelpern, who is the Anne Fleming Research Professor at Georgetown Law and a non-resident senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics. She has published excellent research on government debt, contracts, regulation of financial institutions, and markets. And she has authored a terrific textbook on international finance and has contributed to international initiatives on financial reform and government debt. She co-directs the Sovereign Debt Forum, a collaboration among Georgetown's Law's Institute of International Economic Law and academic institutions in the United States and Europe, dedicated to cutting-edge research capacity in sovereign debt management. She has terrific experience, including in the U.S. Treasury Department, and with Clearly, Gottlieb Steen and Hamilton in New York and London, has taught international finance, contracts, commercial law, financial institutions, and international law, graduate of Princeton and Harvard Law School and London School of Economics and Political Science. And I am one of the many beneficiaries of excellent scholarship and her generous advice. So she is our guest for our fifth Afronomicslaw Indaba, which is a conversation about important topics. And of course, the important topic today is on sovereign debt. And I couldn't have a better guest than Professor Gelpern. So I guess we'll get started. My first question is, how has the sovereign debt market, especially for developing countries, changed over the last decade or so, given the increasing importance of commercial creditors in that market as well as Chinese banks?
Professor Gathii James, this is such an honor for me. You probably don't remember, but back in the olden days, somewhere mid through your very generous introduction, you were already a very well-known and very big deal voice in the international law and development space, international economic law. Back when I was graduating from law school, you were one of the people really writing path-breaking, critical thinking work in the space. So I couldn't be more honored to be here, and congratulations on the, of course, Afronomics initiative. And this is just a really great community. So with that, you had a question. How has sovereign debt changed? Boy, oh boy, has it changed. So, you're going to find I'm going to keep contradicting myself here. On the one hand, it feels like a sea change, right? On the one hand, it feels like back in the day, 10, 15 years ago, we were in a world where the dominant concern was bonds, and the academic conversation was all about the big shift from syndicated bank loans, made by a small number of large regulated institutions in North America, Europe, and Japan, to bonds that were, that constantly changed hands, were placed with institutions that often were offshore, ultimately held by who knows who, tax evading in an island jurisdiction, Lord knows where. And that was kind of the dominant conversation in the sovereign debt space. Well, today, you can't get 30 seconds into a conversation about sovereign debt without somebody saying, what about China? And part of me thinks that this is the right sort of shift in focus, but part of me also wonders how new is it really, right? That I do feel like in the academy, we do tend to, kind of model, we tend to distill, right? In a world that's fairly complicated, we say, well, the real issue is bonds versus loans. But of course, China's been lending in this space forever, just like sovereign wealth funds have been around since, at least mid-20th century. And, if you read some of the historians' work, a lot of the structures and a lot of the relationships we're looking at were, around by a different name and slightly different permutations in the mid-19th century. So what's different today, whether or not it's brand new, is really the just fronting of this incredible heterogeneity in both creditors and borrowers, right? So the bondholders are still around. Surprise, surprise, the banks never went away. Who is syndicating now? Well, commodities firms are syndicating, and they've been around forever as well, right? So you're having this melding of forms. And then to continue the theme, you do have the Chinas and the Russias and the Gulf states of this world, so kind of exporting, surplus countries that have funds to lend, but that were not around or did not have voice at the time, didn't participate in the sovereign debt restructuring and kind of development finance architecture that is very much a product of the second half of the 20th century. So these are often countries, these are creditors that do not abide by the same rigid kind of institutional divisions that we're used to. So you don't, this goes back to this, hybrid and mixing of forms idea that, you don't have purely private and purely public. You may have state-owned, profit-motivated creditors, right? And then private creditors that may be in this for relational reasons or some other kind of long-term objective that is not consistent with the short-term profit-driven kind of incentive structure that the dominant institutions presume. And that's why it's so hard, right? So you have a bond, you don't know whether it is held by a Cayman investment fund, a bank in Japan, the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, or a central bank somewhere that's, managing its foreign exchange. That, you see, to me is the dominant challenge. A small subset, a shrinking subset of these creditors had organized around this, sort of the IMF Paris Club architecture. But if that's 5% of the total, can this architecture drive the process and determine the outcome? And I don't know.
Well, those are really great points. And especially the hybrid and the mixing, the blurring of the public and the private, the entire incentive structure becomes difficult to figure out, but also as you're saying, the increasing number of players is just, it makes this much more different than the 80s, for example, the defaults that came in the 80s. So, so these developments must certainly be challenging, especially now that we see the Zambia default or all these defaults that might be triggered by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so I wonder what your thoughts are. I know you've been thinking very hard about the way to sort of go beyond the Paris Club architecture that you just mentioned in terms of how do countries move forward if they have to restructure and deal with such a complicated set of actors in 2021?
So that, James, is a really zillion-dollar question. And actually, I think we should kind of stop talking about, million-dollar questions and start talking about, millions of lives question, right? And that the trouble is that the process starts before the process starts, right? So the process starts with recognizing that you need to restructure. And one of the interesting and potentially problematic aspects of this diversity that actually has a lot of positives, right? So, countries have many creditors, they're diversified, and that's a good thing. They need investment. But when you're in trouble, what happens is you have 10,000 voices in your head saying, don't restructure because you'll never have market access. Spoiler alert, that's bunkum. On the other hand, you have, well, we'll reschedule. And, if you give us collateral, right? But don't tell anybody else about it. Then you have, well, you can restructure provided you have, the IMF program and, sort of financing all sewn up, right? So all of these different voices are heard before the decision is made by the country that you probably shouldn't be borrowing more without, rescheduling or reprofiling or doing whatever, right? That you have more debt than you can manage, or your debt profile, meaning the payments you have to make, are not consistent with being able to provide for the basic human needs of your population, which is your priority, particularly in this COVID world, right? And without being able to, have some sense of how you're going to manage both the long-term investment needs of the country, particularly given the climate crisis, right? As well as, the debt payments, right? So there's a lot to balance, and now you've got a ton of voices in your head saying, don't restructure, don't you think of missing a payment, do it with me, but, give me half of your natural resources, right? So that to me is a massive, sort of in economist speak, information and coordination problem. So I have actually been cautiously optimistic about this common framework that the G20 agreed on last November. Basically, the idea is all of the G20 governments, and that includes China, it includes India, which is a very, very big creditor in some parts of the world, bigger than China in some places, the Gulf states, as well as the old Paris Club, Paris. And by the way, Russia's been in the Paris Club for a very long time. Not sure how effective that coordination process has worked in that case, right? But so at a minimum, the core governments on the creditor side are at the table. And what's been interesting to me is that they largely sort of brought with them the Paris Club comparability principle, which basically says that, look, none of us wants to subsidize or have our population subsidize payments to another creditor that is basically free riding on our people's concessions, right? So that comparability principle, in theory, should take away the distinction between public and private. It should bring along the bondholders, the banks, and all of the, state-owned, profit-driven, call it Mickey Mouse institutions, right? So sovereign wealth funds, development banks, et cetera, et cetera. Whether that works or not is a huge question. You may have noticed there was no rush to participate in the common framework. There were 3 applicants, so Zambia, Chad, right before the head of state was assassinated, and Ethiopia, which may be getting cold feet because it seems to be hearing those voices, right? That, well, you'll do better if you don't do a comprehensive restructuring, exempt this creditor and, down the line, it'll serve you well. So I worry about that. I think the common framework idea is very promising because A, everybody's supposed to be at the table, and B, it's supposed to take care of this distinction between public and private creditors, which really is just for the birds. It just should, I think we should just stop. We can talk a little bit more about that. But the proof is in the pudding, and the pudding is not quite there.
Yeah, I mean, it's very good to hear that you're very hopeful about the common framework, notwithstanding the challenges. And you already, in the spoiler alert comment, alluded to perhaps one of the challenges that we've already seen in the different contexts of the debt service suspension initiative, which only has to do with suspension of interest payments. And there we've seen the role of the credit rating agencies give some countries pause precisely for the reason you mentioned, that they may not have access to the markets if they get downgraded. And I'm sort of thinking by analogy here, I'm sort of putting the DSSI experience alongside what we might or might not see with a common framework in terms of the types of challenges countries that might be genuinely considering moving under the common framework might experience. I don't know a lot about credit rating agencies, but little I've seen in the literature here in the United States is that it's really been difficult to discipline credit rating agencies, even in the U.S. Sort of I wonder what challenges you think credit rating agencies might pose for the common framework, if at all, and if you think there are ways of sort of addressing this within the common framework so that if countries are actually going to deal with this, especially based on the comparability principle that you alluded to, that perhaps maybe that's one way of thinking of overcoming the difficulties that might be posed by this challenge.
So, James, I'm really glad you brought this up because it's been, so the discussion about credit rating agencies is both right and unfortunately confusing. So there are two extremes, right? On the one hand, it's, hey, rating agencies are just telling it like it is. Don't kill the messenger. If a country is, in a problematic, economic situation, if the fundamentals are not there, sort of don't blame the messenger. And some, folks that are, that I respect a lot have said puzzling things like, it's, so pushing on rating agencies is like pushing for great inflation or sort of arguing with the umpire. I mean, that is very much in theory. I mean, in practice, of course, there's been this entire stream of regulatory reform and policy conversations after the 2008-2009 crisis about how rating agencies, lag the developments, right? B, in the context of structured finance, had, all manner of conflicts of interest, or if you want to be generous, perceptions of conflicts of interest, doesn't matter, right? So the idea that these are just sort of pristine umpires is already problematic. At the other extreme, however, a lot of other people that I respect tremendously say, well, you know what, let's just either ban kind of rating reports in distress or have a competing rating agencies, the agency that would give, good news or more balanced news. it sort of misses the function of these outfits, right? So if the rating agencies are out, are out of the picture, query whether the market that they are supposed to be, influencing is just going to assume the worst. So sort of your lemons. Or if you have a competing, let's say, public rating agency, it's still up to these same funds to listen to it or not, right? So with regulated institutions like banks, I suppose you could tell them, you can only, take into account these ratings and not those. But we've learned enough about finance to know that they'll just work around that, right? So to me, the concern with the rating agencies, I don't want the public sector to get any more entangled with rating agencies than it already is. I thought that the move post-2008, albeit not entirely successful, to get rating agencies out of the regulatory game, to really just, they can say what they want, but it's not good for them or for policy to tie regulation and policy to anything that they say. And so the more we disentangle, the better. The question is then, should anything they do be regulated? And if yes, then what? And one of the things that has troubled me, among many, is the way in which they present information. So this is a real case with, I'll drop country names, but country X is in the middle of a civil war and is going to the Paris Club. One of these things strikes me as a problem. The other strikes me as the first step to solving part of a debt problem, right? And yet in the downgrade watch report, the rating agency leads with country X is going to the Paris Club, and then paragraph 7 or 8 is, oh, by the way, there's a civil war going on, right? By their own terms, this is not really the kind of information presentation that they purport to be, to stand for, right? If you're about medium-term sustainability, then at least in theory, dealing with the debt problem is good for medium-term sustainability. Civil war, not so much. Oh, by the way, it also kills a lot of people and is bad in a million other ways. So to me, if we think about regulating, what I think we should really try to focus on is holding them to their word and focusing on how the information is used. Right. So, for example, during DSSI, as you mentioned, and DSSI in my mind was a monumentally flawed initiative that did some good, but not nearly enough for the problems that I think it actually seeded. But, one of the things that was happening in DSSI, where private sector participation was voluntary, flashing lights, did you hear me, voluntary, is, investors would go to a finance minister and say, if you step over this restructuring line, if you so much as breathe the word restructuring, you're going to be automatically downgraded and you'll never see an upgrade ever again. You would go to a rating agency and say, hey, is that how you do it? And they'd say, oh, no, there is no automatic downgrade, even though if you look at the pattern, it seems awfully close to it, but let's take them at their word. And by the way, if the country restructures and restructures in a way that gives it a sustainable medium-term profile, well, then we'll upgrade it. And I'm kind of like, well, so where's that upgrade information? Like, why don't you say, oh, yeah, and, they'll upgrade. And the answer is not unreasonable. The answer is, well, we don't know how they're going to restructure. We don't know when. We don't know on what terms. This is all negotiated, so we can't promise an upgrade. To which my response is, okay, fine, but surely you've got historical information on, average upgrade, relationship between, timing of the upgrade and the depth of the restructuring. And I suspect that at least in some cases, it will tell the story that if you deal with your debt problem, right, you'll get upgraded right away, or you'll get upgraded soon. Therefore, and this goes back to something we started with, the voices in your head, right, shouldn't be telling you don't step over the line. They should be telling you, put on some earmuffs, step over the line, walk straight, quickly, efficiently, pay attention to your surroundings. And at the end, the quicker you walk, the quicker the upgrade, right? That to me, so this information presentation piece of it strikes me as a promising intervention. We've actually been looking into whether, the royal we and the able research assistants that are noodling this, as you said, there isn't really a good hook to regulate them, but I would think that it's in their own interest to present information in a way that comports with the stated objective.
That's a really great, set of observations about the credit rating agencies, and I couldn't agree more. I want to follow with maybe two things, and you can decide which one you want to focus on. The first is that I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask about the DSSI, which you said was had some fundamental flaws. But I also wanted to see if you could also, in the context of the discussion that you just had about credit rating agencies, whether you could also say something along the lines of what you think the role, for example, of the International Monetary Fund has been. The International Monetary Fund, through its surveillance function, is constantly in touch with all these governments, and it has lots of information on the debt profiles of all these countries, and they must be having all sorts. It must be one of the voices of the many voices that you say are seeking the attention of these governments. And I wonder, in this specific context of how they may be advising these governments to manage this conversation with credit rating agencies, where does the IMF sit? In the past, in past restructurings of the 80s and 90s, we know the IMF, the framework, in the previous frameworks, the IMF played a really key role. And I wonder whether you could tell us anything about the role of the IMF, since it remains such an important player.
So thank you, James, and thank you for the opportunity to rag on DSSI. So first of all, I am first, there's a pandemic. In March 2020, the mindset was kind of sudden stop, right? There's just, a ton of money left the low and middle income countries, and much of it didn't really come back or didn't come back in the same form. And for a long time, for much of 2020, countries didn't borrow abroad. At least there was a ton of domestic borrowing. A lot of it basically boiled down to stuffing domestic banks with government debt paper, which is its own issue. But by the end of the year, even, lower income sub-Saharan African countries went to the market. And so with this sudden stop mindset, a debt suspension makes a huge amount of sense. It was interest and principal payments due in that window, which I think closes end of this year. The trouble is the communique and the term sheet kept using this word voluntary, which, there was some litigation over this in the credit derivative space. And I thought that we learned not to use stupid words like that, where it is, look, everything in life is voluntary and nothing in life is voluntary. And this holds double in the sovereign debt space. So that's first of all. But of course, as a signal, it meant you don't have to. And lo and behold, the private sector, that was a green light for those investors to tell the countries, don't do it or else market access, right? And then second of all, it gives a signal to these new creditors, quote unquote new, right? So with hybrid institutions. So if you're China and you know that, and China is not a monolith, but if you're, let's say, China Development Bank, and you know that if you're private, it's voluntary, and if you're official, it's not, which do you think you want to be, right? So it creates these immense arbitrage incentives, right? And so that to me was just a massive sort of gullibility, cell phone moment. And by the way, it's also terrible for the private creditors because with the private credit, the framework, right? Because for the private creditors, there's this, again, absolutely wrong-headed and ludicrous red herring that they have a fiduciary duty to get every last penny out of the country for their shareholders. That's not right. Fiduciary duty, as we know, is just acting in the best interest. If you squeeze the last penny and then the country defaults, that's nobody's best interest. So, making this voluntary also creates the incentive to make these kinds of arguments to actually have an unsustainable outcome. So that was just bad. Second, the fact that this was limited to low-income country rather than targeted at vulnerable countries. So why is it that the SDR allocation, this is kind of previous the IMF conversation, right? It actually got low-income countries a lot more money than DSSI. Why? Because, would you believe, over-indebted countries are not always the countries that most desperately need the cash to invest in, public health infrastructure, right? So and the countries that desperately need the cash to invest in public health infrastructure may not have debt or may not be paying their debt already, right? So if you're already not paying your debt, suspending your debt service is basically virtue signaling for the creditor. It does nothing for the debtor. And if you don't have a huge amount of debt, congratulations, but you also don't get any financing, even though you desperately need it, right? So sort of as a development financing or a humanitarian financing move, the scope of DSSI made no kind of sense. Pushing off, postponing payments, and this is another gem, keeping net present value creates payment humps the day after the suspension is over, right? Hence the common framework for debt treatments after, beyond DSSI, because lo and behold, there are countries that need debt reduction. Why postpone this? I mean, there's some, argument for postponing because maybe you don't know how sustainable it's going to be or not. But to really just frame it as suspension only and then we start all over again as if nothing happened is a problem. So the issue then is that it creates all kinds of path dependence. Common framework is limited to DSSI eligible countries for no good reason, right? Again, vulnerable countries are not necessarily low income. So vulnerable countries are not necessarily low-income countries. In fact, some of the most vulnerable countries are middle-income countries. Some countries like Sri Lanka were borderline. I mean, it's just, that makes no kind of sense. Second, not having, this voluntariness business and this segmenting of predators creates precedent. By the way, limiting it to over-indebted or to low-income countries also creates a stigma issue, because a country that just got out of the low-income category, whatever that's worth, right, says, hey, I've graduated. I don't want to be like them. And therefore, that again is a disincentive to deal with debt problems. So look, it postponed, I don't know if we cleared $10 billion. And created all kinds of institutional path dependence that I'm not fond of. Is it net good? I wouldn't presume to speak on this for any individual country, right? So if a finance minister, believes that they needed a suspension to survive and having only public sector suspension was essential, I'm not judging. But for architecture purposes, not so great. So did that take care of the did I rag enough on?
No, this is great. I mean, this is really great. I mean, this is really great, and I really appreciate your breaking it down so into such granular ways for us to be able to understand why this initiative was such a wrong-headed initiative. And I think that, the value of these conversations is precisely insights like this, because otherwise DSSI is sold, to the public, so for the creditors, it's got the virtual signaling you mentioned. But I think that the perception out there is that, this was really great, and it's being extended to the end of the year, the suspension to the end of the year. But all these systemic questions and the path dependencies it has created, I think, are really important insights. So I really appreciate the fact that you raised them. And, my last question is really about the IMF, and then we'll close it off.
Right.
I think that's the other part of this conversation, that the IMF, has, as been, a central player. I don't want to say, I don't want to I want you to let us know what you see its role in this crisis.
So, thank you again for highlighting it. I have complicated feelings about the IMF. I have enormous amount. Look, I'm a Washington bureaucrat. That's kind of just if you take the ratio of,
We didn't hear the bureaucrat part.
Right. I mean, or at least I'm sort of bureaucrat adjacent, right? So some of my best friends are Washington bureaucrats. Actually, I was only in the government for a few years, but it really did influence my thinking. The IMF has been, the IMF has changed, right? Just like, we say there's no sort of, China is not a monolith or a point in time. The IMF has changed, and in some ways that's one of the most admirable things about it, right, is its ability to change. The IMF is also a political membership organization with a board, right? So we should, you may remember in first year contracts, there's 20 bishops, the mythical 20 bishops, right? That just, we're not in the land of some sort of divinely inspired, precise scientific opinion of actual fact. So when the IMF does debt sustainability analyses, they have a history of being optimistic, but then again, not nearly as optimistic as some governments are about their own, debt sustainability, or as some of their creditors are about, just, refinance and let's move on. So, there are some stark examples, including Greece, and actually want to go back to this for a second, where the fund was pushing for more debt reduction, more debt relief, and more, sort of more robust changes that the European Union would hear none of. So, and, look, recently in Argentina, the fund didn't even have a program with Argentina. It was exactly a year ago, in fact, and, put out a technical paper that was controversial in some circles, arguing or supporting basically the government's debt reduction argument with its analysis. So, the IMF is not the kind of two-dimensional, austerity uber alles kind of bad guy that it often is portrayed as, and it has played a very constructive role in some cases. That said, there are two issues. One is this art versus science thing, right? And, you have whether a given country's debt stock or debt payment profile is sustainable. My economist friends don't like hearing this sort of thing, but, it's sort of anybody's guess. It depends on your assumptions. And if your assumptions are like yay off, the whole picture falls apart. I mean, Ukraine was sustainable, right before Russia lopped off like all of the export capacity. And, then it restructured. And so it's just, and then add to that the political organization, the membership organization dimension of it, with its, voting that's weighted to the size of the contributions and representation of Europe and underrepresentation of, a lot of middle income countries, only partially fixed recently. This is not your, what's that, the weights and measures platinum bar thing, right? I mean, it's not designed that way. It's a voice whose value is, frankly, the accumulated learning. I mean, what I love about the fund is the just nerd accumulation there. And I think that we should be very careful about kind of separating the learning and the information and the infrastructure for collecting and pushing out information and, analytics and whatnot from the, ideology that inevitably comes with being a, G7, even G20 dominated membership organization. The other dimension of this really reminds me of the vaccine mandates conversation in this country, right? You can go to a country music concert or a basketball game if you show proof of vaccination. Well, that only works if you want to go to a basketball game and, or a country music concert, right? I suppose if you have to show proof of vaccination to buy milk, it's a bit more, or rice or whatever, right? It's a bit more binding. But the big question to me, coming back to what we started with, is does the IMF have the weight as a provider of financing to carry all of the conditionality, right? So There's the policy conditionality you can argue about, but there's also the debt restructuring conditionality. And with an increasingly diverse array of funders, a country can say, you know what? Nice to know you, IMF, but I can get the same amount of money, maybe at a bit more of a markup, but with none of the bells and whistles and none of the information disclosure, none of the kind of, even civil society visibility that might come with the IMF, right? So all of the civil society work that made the World Bank and the IMF more transparent, more open to outside voices, right? Like now is the time to reap the benefits. But, the incentive is frankly to say, I can get it elsewhere. And if a government does not, if the governance is not all it should be, then, it's all for naught, right? So that is something else I'm concerned about.
Well, those are really great reflections on the IMF, and you're pointing to, not that I want to push this any further, but since you mentioned civil society groups and the fact that the recent reforms have opened up a little more space, even when the IMF goes on their meetings, they actually now consult with civil society groups. I don't know if it's pro forma or not, but at least they do. I know in Kenya, for example, the civil society groups take this very seriously, and they actually do a lot of work prior to and after the meetings with the IMF when they're on their visits. And I wonder, for your closing thoughts in terms of thinking forward for civil society groups, we are part of the Africa Sovereign Debt Justice Network, and we are thinking of, what are the things that may have some opening for change over the next 12 or so months, and or even beyond. One of them, of course, is maybe 2023, the IMF's sort of quota reform might come up again, and who knows whether that might shift. There have been debates about things like a sovereign debt authority. There have been some voices regarding all sorts of other types of reforms in the international financial architecture. And I wonder if you were to give advice to those of us that sort of want to think actively about those options, where would you advise us to put our sort of efforts?
So I have a really boring answer, and I'm sure you know what it is, and then I may have some slightly unboring thoughts. So the really boring answer is #public debt is public. I do not buy for 1 second, and I'm growing increasingly impatient with the argument that the presumption is that sovereign debt contracts are confidential. Right? I mean, it's unbelievable to me that we have accepted this state of affairs for this long. And I do think that, civil society and certainly, places like Mozambique, right? I mean, it's really just been instrumental for fleshing out this complex picture that we have. Who are the creditors? Who are the debtors? What is the borrowing process, right? The number of times I'm kind of in the middle of a research project on debt authorization and disclosure. And the number of times that a government comes in and says, actually, this debt was not supposed to be incurred. This, there was no authority. But you know what? They always lose. Why? Because at the time of the borrowing, and again, you're in the U.S., this is, contracts 101, the Justice Department, the Minister of Justice issues an opinion that says this is legal, valid, binding, and enforceable. And then 3 years later, a different Minister of Justice says, no, that Minister of Justice was on the take. And, a court in New York and London just wants to have none of it, right? So I think there is, look, the Philippines in 2020 started posting all of their debt contracts just all of them out there, full text. You can exempt, look, if you want to buy missiles with debt, instruments, I don't love it, but that's about the extent of the exception that I'm willing to entertain. And I find it incredibly patronizing when people say, well, man on the street, woman on the street isn't going to understand these complicated, contracts. Again, BS, right? Like our job as academics and, civil society groups, right? Our time is much better spent reading and analyzing this stuff than, being Google Sherlock Holmes. So that, to me, information is just the starting point and is absolutely essential for accountability. There's an opening in the next, 12 months, 20 months, cynically, because everybody's concerned about China. But China is so not the only one that, has contracts with, collateral features, quasi-collateral features, confidentiality provisions, structural preferences. We need to flush all of this out, and let's use this moment where, creditors are worried about one another to push for this, and they shouldn't worry their pretty heads about simple people on the street not understanding complicated legal language. We'll figure it out, right? So that's, the, point number one. I do think that is a vital part of a broader debt restructuring architecture. So you talked about sovereign debt authority. And as you probably know, I've been sort of a mild skeptic of comprehensive bankruptcy proposals, mostly because I don't see stakeholders agreeing on something that is meaningful and comprehensive, right? So, look at Puerto Rico. That's the closest we've gotten to sovereign bankruptcy. And, lo and behold, the collateralized bondholders are on top, right? So when we say bankruptcy, the question is, what is the distribution that comes out of it? Bankruptcy is basically a comprehensive distribution compact. The advantage is that it's public law, it's sort of out there, and it's publicly legislated or, made as a treaty. It doesn't tell you anything about substance. That, to me, is critical. So I would much rather take sort of partial reform that is distributively right than comprehensive reform that is distributively wrong. And that's my 2 cents.
Well, that's really great. I mean, I think that you're onto something there, and especially in light of your point initially about the complexity of the players and the competing interests. And at each point, you pointed to the difficulties of coordination, and they've only become much more complex. So I want to really thank you for your time and for your willingness to have this conversation and your thoughtfulness and your willingness to be very frank and open. I think this is going to be very well received by our audience, and we appreciate your time very much. And we look forward to keeping in touch, and thanks to you as well for all the people you've introduced to us at the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network. They've been tremendously helpful in continuing to develop our work, and we shall keep you posted as we go along. So thank you very much. And
thank you.
Yeah.
It's been really a privilege, and good luck. And I will definitely keep following your good works. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.